have a question, put it into those quarterly goals, that system, what we're talking about here in the workflow, and then we'll go on to those skills to help work through it. So I'm a big believer in building out that strategy in the system first. So bear with me. Let's get through that, and then we'll move on to some of those skills to help boost morale and the accountability. So where we should be here, theoretically, in an ideal world, is you're clear on what needs to get done this week, this month, this quarter. You've started to build out your daily plan with those next best steps and some of that deep work. You're built this workflow with your team where you know what they're focusing on a weekly, monthly, and daily basis. But we don't live in an ideal world, and there will be new inputs. Nobody is ever just left to their own devices, unfortunately. So how do we deal with new inputs that come into us and or our team that may take us off track? So first of all, when you get new inputs, whether that's a new ask or a new bit of work or a new project or just a new message, you have to decide what needs to happen to that. Is what you've just received something that you need to do? Is it something that you can delegate? Is it something that you have to defer? You can't really make a decision on it right now. Is it something that you want to archive? There's useful information, but there's nothing you need to action. Or is it something that you can trash? Now, for most of us, the things that we get sent, the new tasks, are things that either we have to do or we have to delegate. So let's focus on those two right now. If it's something that needs to get actioned, something that you need to do or you need to delegate, I think it's helpful to define the next best step. What's the next thing that needs to happen to move this input forward? And then to define the relative priority. Based on everything that you've got going on today, where does this fit in terms of urgency and importance? Is it something that needs to get done today, this week, or this month? When you define that relative priority, you're able then to move it appropriately to the daily, weekly, or monthly plan. Here's what happens, unfortunately, too often is anytime a new ask or a new project comes into our team, because of the newness of it, we just assume that it's much more urgent than anything else that's on our plate. But that's not always the case. So think about it. If this is something that you need to do or someone on your team needs to do, what is that relative priority? You want to slide it into a daily, a weekly, or a monthly plan. I'd love to just take some time to talk about delegating new tasks. We're going to focus again on that do or delegate. Here's something that you might find interesting. Successful leaders delegate successfully 80% of things that come in to them, and they do 20%. Now, that I don't mean that they're being lazy in doing that, but what they go through is a process where they ask themselves this question. Is there somebody on my team who, even if they needed a little advice, guidance, and support, could do this? If the answer is yes, then they should delegate that out. And that really should be realistically 80% of the asks that come in to you and your team. That leaves you with those 20% of things that are those things that only you can do, the things that you truly add value to. We have a tendency to hold on to too much that comes in rather than delegating it out, which has two effects. One, it overwhelms us as a manager or leader. And secondly, it prevents somebody on your team from growing or developing. So when you think about new inputs that come into you, ask yourself, is there somebody on my team who, even if they need a little advice, guidance, and support, could do this? If the answer is yes, then you should delegate it out. That can be a little harder to do in a distributed world because you need to identify the person you're going to delegate it to. You need to set up whatever communication it is with that person, and you need to build a feedback and accountability loop. But I'd really encourage you to drive towards this model. Now, if you are going to delegate something out, you don't want to just throw it at them and hope that they pick it up. You want to work through a process that makes sense for them and for you. So the first thing to do is to ask somebody, if you were to take this on, what needs to shift? Because here's the thing. If our manager or leader comes to us and says, hey, I need you to do something for me, can you do it? Our first answer is almost always yes, because we don't want to seem like we're a bottleneck or that we can't take on more work. What that does is that means that we get overwhelmed. And you don't want to end up doing that with members of your team. So just simply asking, hey, I've got something for you. If you were to take this on, what needs to shift? This also gives you good insight into what's already on their workload. I don't know if you've ever found that, you've had a conversation with somebody on your team and they're working on something that the priority has long passed, and it's something that doesn't need to get done or should be handled by somebody else. This is a good opportunity if you've got something else, a new task, to give it to somebody. If you were to take this on, what needs to shift? Then be specific on the outcome. So what's the deliverable, what's the priority, and what's the timeline? But be flexible on the process. Unless the task that you're delegating is just specifically to follow a process, give them some room to decide how they want to get there themselves. Then ask them, when should we next meet to review? When should we next meet to review? Give them the opportunity to say, hey, give me 2 days. I'd love to make some progress on it, and then we'll come back. Rather than just you saying, okay, let's meet tomorrow to review the progress. Give some autonomy to them, and then get out of the way. If they say, hey, we're going to meet next Thursday, then that should be the next time that you review it with them. Now, that doesn't mean that they can't come to you and say, hey, boss, I'm struggling with this. I've got a problem or a challenge with this. That's perfectly fine. But there shouldn't be any in-between pings that say, hey, how's that thing going? If you trust them to do it, give them the time to work through it, and then you can meet to review them. Now, in those review meetings, here's what you should share with them. Here's what you should work through. First of all, get them to reflect on, since the last time that you spoke with them, what went well and what would they do differently next time. Then if you've got some feedback that you'd love to share, if you've reviewed their work product and you'd like to share some feedback with them, it may well come out in this conversation. If they say, hey, this went well, but this didn't go so well, and you're thinking, yeah, that's a really good observation, then that's fantastic. That's something that's a conclusion that they've come to on their own. However, if there's some additional feedback that you'd like to share, just take the opportunity to say, hey, can I share some feedback? So give them the freedom and the autonomy to work through that task or that activity or that project on their own. Give them the autonomy to decide when they want to review with you, and then have them lead the review of how things have gone, what went well, what to do differently next time, and then take the opportunity to share some feedback with them. I've built out a really helpful delegation tracker. One of the things that often happens when we delegate things out is that we lose sight of them. And we don't want to do that because it's something that needs to get done. It's likely something that you need to report in on the progress at some point. And so you'll see on page 7, the table in front of you, a delegation tracker, where you're able to jot down what the action of the project is, who you're delegating it out to, what the specific expected outcome is, what the deadline is, and what the next review is. What I'd like for you to do is just take 2 minutes and just think through those next best steps that are on your to-do list. And which of those could you delegate out? Which of those 80% could you delegate out? And just begin to fill that out for that person. What is the action? Who are you going to delegate it to? Maybe what the expected outcome is. And then that will leave you with the 2 other columns for them to share their thoughts and perspectives. So I'll give you 2 minutes. Fill this out for a specific action that you'd like to delegate to somebody on your team. Okay, excellent. So hopefully you have defined an action that you want to delegate out, who you're going to delegate that to, and then the expected outcome. I'd encourage you after this session to go and have that conversation with them that I just shared with you. Ask them if you were to take this on, what would have to shift. Share what that specific outcome is. Have them share with you when you'd like to next review. Okay, so we have just gone through step 2 in leading a distributed or a virtual team. We looked, first of all, at building that system for ourselves, and then we have looked at how to manage your team's workflow, how to build that monthly, weekly, daily cadence, and then we looked at how to deal with those new inputs, how you should look to delegate 80% of those. We talked through a process for delegating that, and then you also build out one of the items on that delegation tracker. Let me ask you, from that second step that we just went through, what did you notice? What was useful or helpful for you in building out your team's workflow and looking at how to deal with those new inputs? Share with me what was useful or helpful. What did you notice? What feels easy to you? What feels more difficult for you? Perhaps even which aspects do you already do? What are you going to start doing in building your team's workflow? Feel free to share in the chat. Asking what needs to shift. Love that. Love that that's your takeaway, ER. It's hugely important. The last thing that we want to do is just lay on more work for our team. So just getting a sense of what they think their priorities are so that you can begin to delegate that. Great takeaway. Thank you for sharing. What else? All right. Well, getting out of the way from HT. Excellent. Hugely important. No water cooler conversations or virtual water cooler conversations saying, hey, how's that going for you? Delegation as a coaching opportunity, huge tool to use as a coaching opportunity. It's, in fact, the greatest way to help your team grow and develop and to help you elevate your focus away from the day-to-day. Not feeling bad about delegation. Love that. Delegation is such a positive thing. And most of the reasons that we give ourselves to not delegate are usually driven by our own ego. We usually say something like, they wouldn't do it right the first time. I'll only have to fix it. It'll take too long. All of which basically says they wouldn't do it the way that I would want it to do. And that ends up meaning that we shoulder the burden and they don't grow and develop. So love those takeaways. So we've built our personal system. We have managed our team's workflow. Next, I just want to talk about real briefly about 3 tools that can really help push this forward. Now, the degree to which you have control over these tools depends a little bit on your organization and what's already there. And so I want you to take this as light best practice rather than something that you have to necessarily do. Something to consider if you're able to move the needle for yourself. So there are 3 main tools that help manage in a virtual or distributed world. There is a dashboard for you and your team. There are the communication tools that you use to communicate with one another, and then the tools that you use to share files. So when I talk about a dashboard, what am I talking about? It's essentially just a single viewpoint of the most important data for your team. Quite often that has on it the team goals, the progress to those goals, and the key projects that everybody is working on. So if you think about what we've just talked through, defining the quarterly, monthly, and weekly goals, having a place to store all of those goals and the progress towards them, as well as the key projects that add up to it, at a bare minimum, is a really helpful way for you to get visibility into the work that's being done and to track progress against it. Now, this can be just as simple as a text document or a shared text doc in the cloud. It can be a spreadsheet if you're more numbers driven, or if you have already in place some form of project planning software, and you may be saying, Dave, we already have some form of dashboard, which is great. Sometimes you can get dynamic reports from that planning software, tools like Asana or ClickUp or Monday. I would encourage you, if you don't already have just a single viewpoint of that important data for your team, of those team goals, progress to the goals, and key projects, just jot it up in a text doc. Real simple. It doesn't take that long. And just use that to guide your discussions in those monthly, weekly, and sometimes even daily meetings. You can begin to draft out what you need on page 8 of the worksheet. I've given you a place where you can just begin to jot that down if you want to start there. But then I would encourage you to look at whether you want to move that onto a shared doc or a spreadsheet. So having that dashboard as a bare minimum to help get everybody's viewpoint on what's happening is a really good way to ensure that that drumbeat keeps on moving. So we've got your dashboard. The next tool that we're going to look at are communication tools. And I just want you to think a little bit about this. You likely have a range of different communication tools in your organization, whether it's email, chat, whether you do have a project management software, maybe you do have some cloud software, maybe you do have a central knowledge base or a wiki of some sort. How you use those tools can really impact the ability for your team to get work done. So what I want you to think about are the differences of the different types of communications that you need to have with your team. Now, all communication is either synchronous, it happens in real time, or it's asynchronous. Anybody can pick it up at any point and continue the conversation. And then communication can either be short form, short little bits of information, or long form, lengthy discussions or lengthy posts. Each of the 4 quadrants, you may have different items of communication that fall into them. For those things that are synchronous and long form, typically that's a large amount of information being exchanged in real time. Think of status reviews or collaboration sessions, just large amounts of information being exchanged in real time with people there at the same time. For that, you're probably likely going to want to use either some form of video chat or in person. We need to be there at the same time, exchanging this information, and it's a voluminous body of information. Then there are some aspects of communication where it's a large amount of information being exchanged, but it doesn't have to be a back and forward in real time. Maybe you are sharing a new policy or a new initiative or a new process. If you have a knowledge management system, I'd encourage you to use that for those bits of information. When we come down here to the bottom right-hand quadrant, we have small amounts of information being exchanged based on a team member's availability. So just little FYIs or little things you need to know, but you don't need an immediate response for that. There are a bunch of tools that can be useful for this, but one of the most helpful can be a project management app, because usually those bits of information are related to a single project. And then over on the left-hand side, we've got small amounts of information that are being exchanged, but in real time. And the best tool or type of tool to use for is chat. So as you think about the inventory of tools that you have at your disposal, begin to be intentional about the bits of communication that you have. Look at this, and you can fill out on worksheet number 9, you can fill out the information that's there. Use the right tool for the right type of information. So don't use a video chat for small bits of information being exchanged in real time. Don't have an in-person meeting for small bits of information being exchanged in real time. Similarly, don't try to use a project manage app for large bits of information that need to be exchanged collectively in real time. And you might already think, or you might be doing this to a greater or lesser extent. If that's the case, awesome. If not, and you just use a ton of different apps, maybe you use text messages, emails, chat messages, knowledge management systems, sort of willy-nilly, I'd encourage you to get really focused and actually just discuss with your team which apps you use for the specific bits of communication. It can be really helpful to get everybody aligned on these things. Note, by the way, that I don't have email anywhere on this slide. I think email is not really that helpful to communicate in any way, shape, or form. I think that it has passed its usefulness, particularly internally. As we're communicating externally with clients or customers, it's a little different. But for internal communication, email has a lot of shortcomings. And so I would encourage you, if you can, stay away from email as much as possible. But like I said, your degree to pull a lever in this may be kind of small because you don't have control over the tools that are used in your organization. But if you can, I'd encourage you to get really intentional about it. Email is so slow nowadays. It really is. And it's just not good for any bits of information because it just gets trapped in there. So I'd encourage you to look at these 4 different tools. So we've got our dashboard. We've got the communication tools. And then the final thing that you might just want to think about is how do we share files with one another? Often files get lost again in email. So just get really intentional about how you share files with your team. Ideally, there will be some sort of central drive. And if you don't have a central drive and you can put one in place, I would encourage you to do that. Something like Dropbox or Box. Maybe there is a wiki type knowledge management system and you share files that way. Maybe that's a good way to implement it. I would encourage you to not share files via email if you can at all avoid it. And I would encourage you to say that to your team, because what happens if I share a file with you in email, that's not a relative file. I can't change that. Somebody has to open it, change it, and send it back. And that in a distributed world will just slow things down for you so fast and so quickly. So have you got your dashboard up and running? Have you got your communication tools in place? Do you know what you use for what circumstances? And do you have a centralized or cloud-based file sharing system to help you share files on an ongoing basis? Let me ask you that on that discussion around dashboard and communication tools and file sharing. What did you notice? What do you need to put in place? What have you already got in place? What's helpful or valuable for you as you begin to think about managing in a distributed world? Share your thoughts in the chat box. Synchronous communication. It can be, things get lost in there for sure if you do that. We've encouraged source control systems for file sharing. Excellent. Good. Good to hear. What do you do if your teammates insist using email because that's what they are used to? Well, if they are peers and you don't have a lever to control specifically what they use, I'd just encourage you to share with them some of the advantages and the benefits of moving away from that. Lead by example. Give them positive use cases for it. If it's your team that directly report into you, I would just say, hey, let's talk through the pluses and the minuses of using email and see if we might, just for a period of time, shift away and try something else. You can always go back to it if it doesn't work, but it's really helpful to just trial it for a little bit. If you're interested in learning more about moving away from email, I mentioned him earlier, a guy called Professor Cal Newport released a book, I think a year or two ago, called A World Without Email. Super interesting stuff in there. Some really good examples and use cases for organizations and teams that have moved away from email. Excellent. All good takeaways, folks. Thank you so much for sharing them. So we've got 2 sections left. We looked at how to design our own personal system. We looked at how to manage our team's workflow and deal with new inputs. We talked a little bit about the tools that we need to manage that. Next, we're going to move on to how to instill accountability and development into the process. This is the skills part of all of it, and some of the questions on the way through have alluded to that. So accountability is hugely important in a distributed world because our ability to influence the work getting done is just a little less. And so what we want to do is encourage our team as much as possible to take ownership and accountability over what's in front of them. However, instilling accountability in a distributed world is difficult as well. So I want to share with you 5 things that I've found to be really helpful in building accountability and development into all of the work. If you just think through steps 1, 2, and 3, that's the systems and the strategy that we're setting up. And so now is how to bring some skills to really help increase that accountability and make sure the work gets done. The first thing to think about is to connect everything to the overarching vision or perhaps mission of the organization or your team. The reality is that people are much more likely to take accountability and ownership over something if they can see the greater why, if they can see and feel that it's connected to something greater than themselves. And going back to Maslow's hierarchy of needs, that feeling of transcendentalism that comes with the belief or the feeling that we are part of something bigger than ourselves. So it's good to connect things to the overarching vision and mission of the organization. It's almost even more strong if you've got a clearly defined vision or mission for your team as a leader. If you haven't gone through a process of doing that, I would encourage you to do so. You just Google how to create a vision statement for my team and think about the best way to encourage your team to help connect the work that they do on a daily basis to that overarching vision. So let me ask you this. Let me ask you this question. What opportunities do you have to share the vision or mission of your team or your organization? What opportunities do you find yourself in on a daily basis where you could begin to share that vision or mission of your team or your organization? Share in the group chat. What opportunities do you have? What interactions do you have on a daily basis with your team where you could share a bigger or a broader vision or mission with them? JT says bi-weekly team meeting. Absolutely. I'm on page 11, by the way, if anybody needs to take some notes. Yeah, really good place. Just starting with, here's the vision or mission of the team or the organization. Just great to share that there. We have check-in meetings as well as planning meetings. Yeah, for sure. Daily meetings, all great opportunities to share that. Here's the thing that I find is often the work that needs to get done becomes the focus. And so we just get right into that. Whereas if we can just take a pause and just help elevate everybody's focus and just recenter and realign on what we're really trying to achieve, just taking 3 to 5 minutes to do that is super helpful in just increasing that level of accountability and morale, because people are reminded of that great why. Go back to Simon Sinek's stuff on connecting with the why, just sharing that on an ongoing basis. And here's what's even better is if you can move away from you sharing it to having your team share it. Either just share what they think the vision or the mission is, or maybe share an example or two of where they've seen somebody take strides towards achieving that. Have it as a discussion rather than just reading it off a sheet of paper. Like, talk about opportunities that people on your team have to get closer to achieving that. Get them excited about it. So we've got daily meetings here, 2 times stand-ups a week and 2 times optional. Water cooler chat, video meetings a week. Awesome TH, all good opportunities. Here's one thing that you need to know. As a leader, it needs to get to the point where you start to feel physically sick about talking about the vision and mission of your team or your organization before your team is actually beginning to get it. Sometimes we just think, we can just rattle it off once or twice and people begin to understand it. If you want it to be living and breathing for them, it's got to be an ongoing conversation. So I'd encourage you, if you don't already do it, make that be your one takeaway from today's session. That'll help significantly increase accountability, significantly increase morale. So assuming that we're taking those opportunities to connect everything to the vision, the next thing that we need to do is to clearly define work, or have the folks on our team clearly define the work. Working in the distributed world, by its very nature, can lead itself to ambiguity. And it's much harder to see when somebody goes off in the wrong direction. The problem is, if you don't clearly define work and people don't have a clear understanding of what they need to do, you can end up spending a lot of time, money, energy, and resources going in the wrong direction. It's kind of like playing golf. I don't know if you do. I do occasionally, not very well. But there's the moment that you strike the golf ball in your swing. And if you hit the golf ball a millimeter off from where you mean to hit it, the ball doesn't end up a millimeter away from where you want it to land. It ends up in the water or the bunker, or in my case, 2 holes over. Even just a nuanced misunderstanding on what we're there to do and to achieve can end up putting that ball a lot further away than we want it to. So just taking a moment to clearly define the work can be really helpful. And that delegation tracker that you have that's in the workbook is just a real simple way to do that. Just defining what the action or the project is, who's in charge of it, what the expected outcome is, what the deadline is, and when the next review date is, will just help ensure that you've got a clearer connection with those people on your team about what it is that they're doing. So if they can see what the vision and the mission is of the team and the organization, and you clearly define the work, that just brings alignment and accountability and higher morale. Next thing we need to do then is, once we connect everything to the vision and clearly define the work, is to build in regular feedback loops. We sort of talked or touched a little bit on those earlier, but here's a 5-step process to go through anytime you want to talk through feedback with somebody on your team. This can be mid-project. It can be on a more regular review cycle. Just think through which of these questions might be helpful. And these are questions that you ask of the person on your team. Okay, well, what did you try? Since the last time that we reviewed this bit of work, or since the last time we reviewed your goals, what did you try? What was the outcome? What did you learn? What will you try next? And how can I help? I see how this feedback loop is focused on getting them to understand and come to conclusions on what they learned, what the outcome was, what they want to do next. The more that we can give the autonomy and freedom to our team to make their own choices, the more they'll learn and grow, the more that they'll develop. The more that we try to manage that process, the more restricted that they feel. And here's something that's really important to bear in mind. Every time somebody on your team grows and develops in a particular way, that's an opportunity for you to provide even more meaningful and impactful work to them, which then allows you to get out of the weeds. Delegation and feedback are a hugely helpful tool for you as a leader to elevate your focus away from the day-to-day tactical runway level things towards where you add most value as a leader, which is thinking about the long-term direction of your team and development of your people. So delegate and feedback loops are super helpful in doing that. So we've connected everything to the vision. We're clearly defining the work. So folks are excited about what they're going. They're clear on what they need to do to get there. You're building regular feedback loops to help them grow and develop on specific tasks. Then we've got to ensure that we celebrate success. Some organizations are much better at this than others. Unfortunately, I feel that more organizations are not as good at this. Celebrating success is hugely important. It gives us an endorphin rush. It gives us a sense of meaning, a sense of purpose, a sense of value. It makes us want to take ownership and accountability the next time. If we work through these steps as a leader, we connect everything to the vision, we clearly define the work, and we build regular feedback loops, but we don't celebrate success, there's ultimately no payoff for the other person, unless it's just a deep internal payoff. So let me ask you this. What ways can you celebrate the success of members of your team? What ways can you, or do you already, maybe you already do, what ways can you celebrate the success of members of your team? Share in the chat. If you were to start tomorrow celebrating the success of team members, what could you do? Talk about it in retrospective meetings. We acknowledge it department-wide. Demo days, love that. Great. Call out achievements in team meetings for sure. Praising, absolutely. Requesting a raise, can do. Quarterly lunches, superb. All good examples. And here's something to consider that I think that's hugely important. Great leaders take more blame than they give, and they give more praise than they take. The best leaders out there that I've ever seen are constantly singing the praises of their team, usually to other peers and to higher ups. Leaders that don't grow as far and as fast and don't bring in degrees of effectiveness are the ones that show up and take all of the praise for themselves. And so I would encourage you, celebrate the success of members of your team, both to their face and also whenever they're not in the room. You're the advocate for your team members in the rooms with higher ups. And so bring that attitude towards sharing that praise amongst the rest of your team. All great examples. And if you don't already do some of those, would encourage you just to take a look through the chat. Make sure to jot down on the worksheet. I think we are on page 12, right up at the top, where it says celebrate success. Jot down an idea or two that you'd love to take away to put in place to help celebrate that success. So we're working through how to build in accountability and development. We're connecting everything to the vision. We're clearly defining the work. We're building regular feedback loops on that work that's getting done and carried out. We're celebrating success when things are great. And then the fifth thing to really help cement all of this is to have ongoing development conversations. Now, these don't have to be long, wieldy, 45-minute or 60-minute coaching conversations. These can be conversations that just happen on the in-between bits, just on a day-to-day basis. But thinking through the long-term development of your team and helping them get there is a really crucial way in just cementing that accountability and ownership. So I want you to think about your development conversations along these two axes. The first one is, in some of these areas, folks are going to be really high-performing. And in some of these areas, people are going to be pretty low performing. Then development occurs on a spectrum. It starts on the left-hand side here with functional things, just their ability to do the job, all the way over here to the right-hand side, to those areas that are more holistic. They're more based around the person as a whole. If you think about things that are on the left-hand side, there are things like skills, just your functional ability to do the job, whether that's coding or delegation or Excel. And by the way, the positioning of the text there, I don't mean it to indicate that it's low performance in this instance. I'm merely just describing the things that sit at the functional end. So everybody on your team are either going to be low performing or high performing at their skills, their functional ability to do the job. Then as we move to the right, we want to take a look at their behaviors, how they show up. Laziness, optimism, empathy, with their own degree of ownership and accountability. Kindness. And again, folks are going to be low performing in some of their behaviors and some are going to be high. We then move towards patterns of behavior. And our patterns of behavior are just repeated behaviors in similar settings. So maybe you notice that somebody's late every Tuesday. Well, that's a pattern that may be worth exploring and talking about. And then finally, the areas that you might want to think about concerning yourself with are just the overarching identity of the people in your team. Things like their core values, their purpose, their why, their beliefs, and their mindset. So I share this with you because I want you to see that you can have development conversations along this spectrum. It doesn't have to all be skills-based, doesn't have to all be identity-based. It can be a mix of the four. Now, here's the thing. For anything that falls in the left-hand side here towards more functional aspects of the role, the skills and the behaviors, it's really relatively easier to coach folks through these, to have those development conversations, because actually really all you need is accountability. Hey, I noticed that your skill in this area isn't as strong as it probably could be or should be. What would you like to do to develop it? How can I hold you accountable? Hey, I see this behavior, it seeps out from time to time. What can we do to change that and shift that? How can I help you by holding you accountable? Whereas the things that fit into the right-hand side, they're a little trickier, and you might want to spend a little bit more time having development conversations focused on skills and behaviors before you begin to move towards patterns and identity. Because here, you're sort of bringing a little bit more insight to it. It's a little bit more of a challenging conversation. But I encourage you, if you don't already have these development conversations around skills and behaviors, begin to put them into place. If you feel pretty confident about your ability to do that, maybe start having conversations around the patterns of behavior and more holistic viewpoints of the identity of the person and where they want to get to and where they want to grow to. Because if you can add in those development conversations into the mix, into these 5 steps, that's where your team's growing. That's where they're really starting to get a sense of belonging. That's where they can see that not just is the work great, that is it not just connected to an overarching vision? Am I not just getting regular feedback loops? My success is being celebrated, but I'm also getting the opportunity to work on areas, on large parts of who I am and how I want to show up. So that's accountability and development. I'd love to hear from you on that section. What did you notice? What was helpful? What was useful? What are you going to take away? What are you going to put into place to help encourage your team to take more ownership and accountability? Share in the chat with us. Involve your team in planning and more bought into the outcome they will be. Put in place more of a development discussion. Excellent, Elsie. You can just add it to an agenda of a meeting that you already have. ER says missing celebration and more structured development. Excellent, good takeaway. And just as you're jotting through those, make feedback more of a two-way discussion. Yes, absolutely. And start with them. The more that your team can come to their own conclusion about the things that they need to work on, the better. The development discussion and the split is really interesting. Excellent. Glad that was helpful for you, PR. Okay, so we have covered a lot so far. I know there's a ton in there. We've looked at how to design your personal remote-first system to ensure that you're focused on the work that needs to get done. We've then looked at your team's workflow, how to manage that, those interactions, those meetings that you need with them. We talked about how to deal with new interruptions that come into your day. We looked at those 3 tools that'll help in your virtual toolkit. We spent some time looking at instilling accountability. Next, I just want to spend a few minutes and give you the opportunity to define or to build your action plan. So what I'd like you to do is, considering everything that we have talked about, choose no more than 2 to 3 things to work on. There may be a ton of things in there. The problem is, if we commit to doing a bunch of things, we end up doing none of them, or we end up doing them all badly. And so I'd love for you to think about 2, no more than 3 things to work on. Page 13 in your workbook will help. There's a table in here. I just want you to jot down, what will you do as a result of this session? What does success look like? When will you complete this? And what help do you need? I want to give you 3 minutes and just have you jot down your action plan, either on a bit of paper or in the workbook on page 13. Jot down the 2 or 3 things that you're going to work on. Likelihood that you'll put that into practice. I'm just sharing some research from the Association of Talent Development about the probability of completing a goal. We're at about 50%. If you just work through that last exercise and you've planned how you will do it, which is good, but it's about the same odds of you achieving it than guessing a coin toss. The 2 additional stats at the bottom point to the importance of accountability in achieving our goal. goes up to 65% if you commit to somebody else that you'll do it, and then 95% if you have a specific accountability appointment with the person to whom you committed. So I'd encourage you to think about who might be able to hold you accountable to putting in place that action plan. Could be your boss, could be a peer in the organization, could be a mentor, could be somebody completely different. Think about somebody that you meet with on a regular basis and somebody that you'd be excited to share your 2 or 3 actions from this session and get them to hold you accountable to it on the times that you meet with them. I'd encourage you to drop them a note after this session and say, hey, I've got something that I'd love to share with you the next time we meet. Accountability is a hugely useful tool in ensuring that we stick to our goals. Got one question that came in from OD just before we wrap. It said the examples and theories you have talked about is with the assumption that the person you lead has